So rather than try and walk through too many different examples, I'm going to kind of take a broader approach to chatbots. I'm going to kind of walk you through the landscape, walk you through both the what's been going on in the industry across the last few years, just to give you a few perspectives of what's been happening so that we can sort of orientate ourselves as designers in response to this fairly emerging medium at this point in time. So the example that I have on screen is just a simple one that I found on the internet. It's a chatbot based on a website. There are a lot of different ones out there. A lot of them are based around customer service or help and support. There are a lot of different examples of chatbots on other platforms as well. So another one that you may have come across before, if you're a Slack user, are chatbots that are designed for the Slack platform. But you also have bespoke systems. So this is Ada Health. Highly recommend you try it. It's an iOS application. And they spent the last 6 years trying to build a huge knowledge base and power it through conversations to basically do things like health assessments, kind of do health tracking and things like that. It's a really, really great immersive experience. And you may not have a really one-to-one relationship like you would with a normal person, but I think the medium of conversations is quite natural for what this app is trying to help you with, which can be quite personal, it can be quite sensitive and broad. So I really encourage you to check it out. I think by far the most popular type of chatbots emerging today in the last 2 years, I think, have been chatbots on messaging apps like Telegram or Kik or Facebook Messenger. The examples that I have on screen is one of my favorites. It's the TFL travel bot. It's been around for about a year or so. It's actually just won an award in the last week. And I actually know one of the guys who are working on it. They've got a really good design team that's been focused solely on this application. And it pretty much does what you expect it to do. I'm going to sort of play a video here to let you see how it works. As you can see, you kind of type into the screen. It kind of has the ability of showing you these interactive cards. So it's not just text that you're using to converse, but you're able to get into some of these cards, some of which, if you click on them, will open up a full screen experience. So it overlays on top of the messenger window and back again. So it's really immersive. It's also really powerful in terms of its capabilities to integrate with back-end systems and third-party services and so on. So the technology is definitely progressing, but there are still a lot of issues related to chatbot experiences, and I'm just going to cover a few of them right here. As you can see on the screen, if you've played around with chatbots recently, a lot of them are quite linear in their sequencing and overall experience. It almost feels kind of like when you're clicking on these buttons, you're not really in a conversation with a chatbot. You're kind of clicking almost like a sequence of steps. So you almost feel like a human puppet amongst this game. And chatbots also aren't really self-aware, right? So they're not actually human beings. They don't understand what's actually happening in the real world. So they have a very limited focus. And they also have a very limited ability to handle their own limitations and errors, sometimes too badly. And I think there are some ways to get around that, and I think that's where the strength of designers can really help to alleviate some of these problems from an experience perspective. But there you go. I think it does show that there are some limitations within the technology and within the design solutions that we haven't quite gotten there yet. Another thing that I've come across is the inability to handle multiple lines. So in conversations, it's really easy for us to say, okay, this and that in multiple lines, but machines can't parse that very well. I've seen some progression in small exceptions where there's been a lot of huge investment done into the underlying machine. And so, but by far most of the apps out there, chatbots, are not that sophisticated. But I think the worst one of all is its poor use of personality. And because it doesn't really understand context, when designers or developers go too far to embed personality into chatbots, it can end up in disastrous situations. In fact, this one turned into a PR nightmare for Microsoft, which when they launched Tay, a teenage chatbot, quickly ended up into a lot of racist slurs and things that ended up being pretty catastrophic, and they had to turn it off. Not even a day that it was launched. So it's clear that if you look at the landscape, there's been a lot of growth and attention on chatbots, but there's also been a lot of hype along with it, and it can sometimes feel like there are more people talking about chatbots than there are people using them, which is, I don't think that's true. I think that the stats are encouraging that people are now starting to use chatbots on a lot of major platforms. But when I learned that I was going to be assigned to this project about chatbots, I was kind of like, do I really want to be working on something and delivering a really crappy experience if I know that I'm going to be working with fairly limited resources and so on. But then as I started working on it, I realized there's a huge opportunity for designers to really respond to this emerging medium to really affect the outcomes. One of the things that when you will get into when you start digging into the space is that there's a lot of content out there, and one of the things that I tried to do was to try to make sense of this whole phenomenon. And I think it comes down to a few of these key drivers, right? So AI, investment, messaging, media, and platforms. So there's been a huge push in artificial intelligence. There's been massive sums of money being invested into artificial intelligence, and that's by far the most prominent driver behind the chatbot phenomenon. You can kind of think as AI as this huge iceberg and the chatbots being at the tip of it, because chatbots are a really easy, accessible, and tangible expression of what artificial intelligence systems can do. And so they become really quick ways for entrepreneurs and startups and organizations of all shapes and sizes to build experiments by creating these chatbots to see what can they really do with it. And obviously that's not the only way they're doing it, but chatbots are by far the most popular. If you take a look at what are some projections for the market for chatbots, that's one source that I found is estimated the chatbot market to be somewhere around $1 billion US dollars by 2024. That pales into comparison, right, against the market for artificial intelligence, which is a measure of times much larger. You may have heard the quote from Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. He said that chatbots are the new apps. Although when you start to look at the numbers for mobile apps, that's also still increasing, and it still doesn't quite make sense if you're going to take that trajectory and compare chatbots to apps. I think that you will start to see a blend of chatbots being integrated into apps and services and websites and so on. Then there will be kind of chatbots taking over things. Another key trend has been the rise of messaging apps. And at somewhere around April 2015, that number surpassed the use of social networks. And that suddenly created a huge surge of interest to deploy artificial intelligence based solutions into messaging platforms. And as you can see, this has been just the spectrum of different startup organizations doing work around chatbots. And there's a few interesting investments prior to April 2015, but you can see the traffic really increase past that point. So I kind of see this as really expensive experiments, and it's not clear right now where it's going to go, but you can clearly see that money is being put into the industry. And then finally, there's the media, and I think that's where we tend to go to first to gain knowledge and information about chatbots, to ultimately learn and make sense of this space so that we can work with it as a material. I think predominantly the key driver for a lot of the content that's been out there, the growth of content has been because of the rise of platforms. I mean, because there have been more platforms for developers and designers to work on, more people have been able to talk about it. And so even though we may see a lot of the hype and attention from a media perspective, I think that by far there's a lot more content also both from the academic side and the practitioner side around chatbots. So it's really good to understand how all of these different perspectives play out so that we can kind of zoom in on what we really need to do our work. I'm going to kind of pause here to talk briefly about artificial intelligence. That's not the focus of my talk. I'm not going to go into too much detail for AI, but it's kind of good to understand what's happening under the hood. I won't be able to do a good service around it, but it's kind of interesting when you start to open the hood and you see that there are a lot of these different components, and it's really hard to make sense of how they all play a part. At the same time, they're all not one. There's no one-size approach to building chatbots. So depending on which system you work with, they may make use of a lot of different types of systems. And then if you move to another one, they'll use a completely different component set. So it really is important to kind of know what you're working with, because that can severely give you the capabilities that you need or severely limit you in terms of what you can or can do as a designer. So here's an example from IBM Watson. This is their conversation platform, which they promote and provide for designers and developers to create chatbot experiences. And as you can see, this structure follows a very sort of tree-based format. And that also affects how the chatbot experiences turn out. It's very sort of yes, no, if you say this, then the chatbot responds in a certain way. It can get a bit tricky to go back into the previous element of the conversation or restart conversations in mid-flight. So again, this is one example of how one platform might influence the way a chatbot experience works. Another platform, go back one, which I really like using is API.ai, which has now been renamed Dialogflow. And the reason why I really like this is because it's really easy to use for designers. You don't really need to know a lot about machine learning. It does make use of machine learning to basically predict what and match sentences that are being inputted by users. So the idea is that you can train the machine to recognize sentences like that. So order a pizza, or I would like to order, and you can type in as many variations of that sentence, and then the machine learning, once it hits save, it will start to do its training, and you can test the system directly in the platform here to see how approximate sentences will map to this intent. So the order you see on the top is called an intent. So the intent is basically like a program that gets executed when the user says something that matches one of those sentences. And interestingly as well, it has capability of detecting certain words which it will map to programmatically to these things called entities. So if you say, I want a delivery, so you can specify within the system that deliveries have certain configurations or certain parameters, and you can almost code the conversation using these entities by teaching the system to parse certain words as special keywords. Let me know if this is getting too technical, but hopefully this will be the last time I kind of get into the technical part of it. So API AI is not obviously has its limitations. If you want to do like really, really deep integration with platforms like Facebook Messenger, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. So if you really want to do that, then you might want to move over to a platform like wit.ai. So again, coming back to limitations, right? So depending on what you're trying to do, you might choose a different platform because it's easier to use, or it's less technical, or it gives you more capability, but then you're trapped by the tool. The moment you're trapped by the tool, it starts to inform how you think about that space. And you can quite quickly get down the rabbit hole, and you really don't want to do that because you want to kind of keep a little step back from that almost. You want to be able to kind of influence the strategy of how the conversation works. You want to be able to influence the scope of what you're doing. And I think that's really key for us as designers when we're working with technologists to build these things out. So I like to share this quote from Don Norman. He wrote it in an article about simplicity a few years ago. And I think there's a truism here that the whole point of human-centered design is to tame complexity, not to not to make things simple. Even if it's things like chatbot experiences. Ultimately, I think the reason why I say this is because it's not so much about creating an experience, but managing the level of complexity that you may end up with if you're not careful when you're trying to create that experience, which is why I think this is a great reminder. So I'll start to talk about some solutions now. I think I'd like to break that down into 4 parts. Understanding users' expectations and needs, clarifying constraints, designing with conversation as a medium, and shaping processes to improve outcomes. And these are fairly broad areas, which I think, no matter how you approach it, will end up becoming part of your problem when you're working on this medium. The first part is the dialogue, right? If you're trying to work with dialogue, what are some approaches that you need to think through in order to gain some sanity about where do you start, how do you make it work? And there's this chicken and egg situation with dialogue where, how do you get people to even say the right sentence? Because if you get it to say something that the chatbot isn't capable of handling, then it's going to throw an error. So there's a lot of expectation setting you need to do up front in a very short, concise format, because you don't want to be pushing large chunks of paragraphs into a chat window. And then you got to be thinking through the sequencing of that interaction across time. It's also important to understand what are people thinking of when they start to interact with these systems. What are their perceptions? What do they need to do as well? Because as with other systems, a chatbot is just a tool to get something done. It may be conversational, you may feel as though you're interacting in a human way, but a user isn't there to have a conversation. It's there to get a job done. So you're just using conversations to facilitate that task to be completed. So I've just come up with a few approaches. Some of it is kind of generative, where you're working through call center logs to find things that people are already asking for. That's a really good source. But you can also ask, get people to play with a prototype and just tap into kind of like a fake tool to get them to give you starting points of where this might be. And then the broad expectations and needs, there is very little data I've found regarding this. One study that I did found kind of was refreshing because it validated my assumptions that users don't really want to sit there and have a conversation with a chatbot for half an hour. They really expect these chatbots to assist in basic tools and queries, get it done faster. Can I get it done faster than the website? Can I get it done better than searching in Google? And be straight to the point, right? It's a conversation. I've got a question, give me my answer. However, people are also conscious, this thing is not able to do everything. So they don't expect chatbots to answer all the questions. They don't expect them to fully understand everything, or be intuitive or reliable or offer opinions or be too expressive. So, that's kind of where your problem space is, right? You're working with people's expectations and perceptions, and that's your playground for ensuring that, you get it right. Another important thing that designers will bring to the table is their ability to really critically question what exactly are we building. Oftentimes, chatbots end up becoming problems in search of a solution, and then we have to ask the hard questions. Who is the audience here? What problem are you trying to solve? Why are we doing this? Why, and how is this better than alternatives out there? Are we just doing this because we want to showcase a piece of technology? In which case, we might not get very far. And so I created this diagram for my client to say, let's start with the purpose. Let's baseline what we're trying to achieve for our audiences. And then, even though the platform was already there, derive what we need the platform to support us in service of the purpose. From that, then we start to map out, okay, what are the capabilities that we need to build with this chatbot? What should it do in service of the purpose and given the capabilities that we have? And then finally, the personality derives from that. So we don't work from the personality down to the funnel. We can work it back all the way up. So these are some other tools I've used to just help people prioritize the behaviors and capabilities of a chatbot. The third thing I'll mention is, when we're working with chatbots, the underlying medium is conversation. And so I found this really useful resource on Google, which has been written for developers, but I find that it's a really useful set of resources to help open my mind into the world of conversations, right? The mechanics of conversations, how conversation works, what people expect when they enter into conversation and so on. So that whole space is known as conversational analysis, and a sister domain called dialogue analysis. It's been around for ages. It's an ethno-methodological method that's been designed to really understand human interaction through conversation. So definitely dig into that resource because you'll gain a huge amount of knowledge about how conversations work as a material. And then finally, there'll be a lot of things that haven't been figured out in this space. The tools are not mature. They are all different amongst each other. They all try to solve different problems at different scales. Some are more sophisticated than others. So a lot of times you're having to find workarounds, especially at the people level. How do we work together as a team of multidisciplinary designers and developers to actually achieve the outcomes that we want? So that's kind of where I am at the moment. I mean, I'm starting to map out a set of workshops to baseline how do we do governance? How can we put in a process to manage content? So if, for example, the chatbot needs to talk about product information, and product information expires, how do you manage that? There's revision control, there's authorship, there's permissions and settings. And all of that stuff hasn't been supported because the tools are not designed for chatbots, which, obviously they're not in a kind of article format. They're all pieces of content that string together depending on the interaction into a conversation. This is a nice quote from my colleague Elvia Vasconcelos, who also works at Sapient. She's also been doing some work on chatbots, and she's written some of her thoughts and experiences on her website, and this is what she says. So she found herself adjusting and tweaking conventional UX methods to better suit working with conversations, and that was really crucial for a successful collaborative design process. So it's inevitable that you're having to make things up. I don't think that you should shy away from it. No one's figured it out yet. So definitely take that confidence forward and have fun with the material. Have fun trying to shape the ways to make it work for you and the team. A few years ago, Garry Kasparov made headlines when the IBM supercomputer defeated the world champion. And I watched an interview where he kind of expressed some experiences from that process. And he laments that AI technology is neither good or bad. Just like chatbots, it's just agnostic. It's kind of there. It's around us. And we just sort of have to adjust. And that's kind of what we need to do as designers. And I think that's what we do really well, kind of forming out solutions out of really ambiguous spaces. So in closing, that's what we need to do to make chatbot experiences more meaningful. And if you want to reach out to me for questions, I'd be happy to have them. Thank you.